Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to the Byline Times podcast. The Byline Times is what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, tragedy chanting and the tabloid-inspired narrative about the city of Liverpool that just won't go away. Tragedy chanting, in case you don't know, is the practice of football crowds taunting their rivals about some of the worst things you can ever imagine happening. For years, Manchester United supporters had to listen to opposition fans gloating about the Munich air disaster in 1958, which claimed the lives of 23 people, including 8 United players and 3 members of staff. Despite that experience, some United fans were heard at the weekend's FA Cup quarter-final mocking Liverpool supporters about Heysel and Hillsborough, twin catastrophes from the 1980s in which more than 130 fans died. The Sun newspaper famously blamed Liverpool supporters for Hillsborough and accused them of urinating on and pickpocketing from the dead. The headline of that piece was "The Truth," but it was a lie. It wasn't until 2012 that an independent inquiry declared that the police had engaged in a cover-up and that they had spread false information in an effort to hide their own mistakes. Let's speak to journalist and broadcaster Tony Evans, who was at Hillsborough in 1989 supporting Liverpool and who has been understandably angered by this latest round of tragedy chanting. Tony, welcome. And sad to say, sickening though it was to hear those taunts and those chants at the weekend, this was by no means an exceptional incident in the lives of Liverpool supporters.
Yeah, not at all, Adrian. In fact, I've stopped being angry about it. It's just saddening because you hear it so often and it's hung around since the disaster, 35 years now. And the worst thing is that it's actually mushroomed over the past 3 or 4 years, particularly post-pandemic. It's got worse and worse.
Yeah, I know there was an incident at Luton towards the end of 2023, and again, on this theme of the kind of right-wing tabloid narrative about this, the chants by Luton Town supporters were defended by Rod Liddell, not in a tabloid newspaper, actually, although he is a tabloid man at heart, but in the Times newspaper, saying that, yeah, it's wrong, but people have got to accept this kind of thing and effectively put up with it.
It's all right for fools like Liddell who haven't had the experiences that we've had. But, 35 years ago, it might seem like ancient history to a lot of people, but to me, it's very real. I go back there in my nightmares too frequently, and there are many people like me. And what makes it worse and what makes it really aggravating for people from Liverpool in particular, and people like me, is that what's so important about Hillsborough is not that it happened, and not that it happened to football fans, but that the authorities, with the aid of the media, threw the blame at people who were the victims of it, and then conducted an extensive cover-up to avoid taking responsibility. And no one was ever held accountable for the mistakes. And if you think that sounds ridiculous, in the 2017 Manchester Arena bombing, at least 2 of the victims died from the same systemic problems with the emergency services as caused so many deaths at Hillsborough. What we should be doing is we should be looking at why these things happen. We should be holding people accountable because they're willing to take the pay and the awards that they get as senior policemen. And what we should be doing is making sure these things happen again. We campaign for Hillsborough. It's not for us. That ship sailed. We're never going to get justice. It won't happen to anyone else.
I don't want to trigger you, and you've talked about the post-traumatic stress that you suffer as a result of Hillsborough. Again, though, just to give people who weren't there a sense, just tell me a bit about what happened to you.
Well, I come down to the gates about 2:45. There's a pretty big crowd there. I didn't think it was anything unusual by the standards of the day. Worked my way through the crowd to get to the front. Just as I got there, the gates opened. So I went through and I was in the stands and me and my mate went through together. He went down the tunnel and had a very near-death experience. But I was in the stands around the 18-yard line and I saw what was happening. And it began to unfold and I saw a guy have his shirt pulled over his head and I thought, there's people dead. And there was a fella, a young lad, walking around. He was holding his arm at his elbow, and it was in a right angle, sort of halfway up the forearm. So you could see that there was crushing injuries. So I've been trained in CPR, which not that many people were in the 80s. So I ran round the back, and I come in the forecourt at the back of the Leppings Lane, and there was a line of police just standing there. No one doing anything, just standing there in a line. There's pictures of it. You can go and look them up on the internet. And there was people sunbathing, I thought. And I was like, why are you sunbathing at a time like this? And then I realised they were dead. And the police just stood there. There was injured, dead and dying. And the police stood there, didn't move. And it's one of those things I'll never understood, that the basic lack of humanity in not helping. And I wonder how badly damaged those policemen must be when they think back to it. But the narrative was set on that day. The match commander, he said Liverpool fans broke down the gates when he, in fact, ordered them to be opened twice. That narrative went round the world. And as for the other lies, you mentioned the urinating on the police. Where that originated from was at the other end, the Nottingham Forest fans. There was a WPC standing there, and she said she saw Forest fans urinating off the back of the cop and shouting down, "What's the hold up? What's the hold up?" And suddenly it became Liverpool fans doing it to police. I actually doubt the Forest fans were aiming at the police, because in the 80s, the facilities were so bad. People often used to go and do their ablutions somewhere quite near the terraces, the walls at the back. Often the stairs ran like waterfalls of urine. So I doubt they were doing it. But suddenly that became one of the big stories. And just before I finish that, this is why it's important to people, and why it should be really important, is because one of the other notorious stories was that there was a girl getting treated by police, dying, and Liverpool fans said, "Throw her up here, we want to give her one," making sexual comments. That actually came from a police hotline. There were two people who phoned in to this police hotline within 20 minutes of each other. One we traced was related to the senior policeman who was running the hotline, and the other one lived next door to him. This was police covering up their own failings. And seriously, if you think chanting always the victims at Liverpool fans, because we still go on about Hillsborough, is clever. And what you're saying is we agree with police cover-ups. We agree with not taking responsibility. Well, in this rotten country, I'm not surprised with this government, because obviously people vote for people who won't take responsibility.
And in the 80s, there was a narrative about Liverpool, wasn't there? This wasn't an isolated incident. You had the political activities of Derek Hatton and militants who were very closely associated with Liverpool. So this othering of Liverpool, and by extension, the supporters of Liverpool Football Club, was part of a bigger story about the city.
Oh, definitely, definitely. But it goes back way beyond the 80s, Adrian. It goes back to the potato famine, when the nature of Merseyside changed basically in the space of months. As many as 3 million Irish immigrants came in. Many of them left and went to America and Australia, but a large proportion of them stayed and changed the political tone of the city from what was up till then called Tory Town into a very radical city. For example, where I come from, in the Scotland Road area, we had an Irish nationalist MP until 1929. So Liverpool was outside the political pale of mainstream British politics, and it continued to be. Militant was using insults all the time. People spit it out. Someone in a pub 6 weeks ago explained to me about the whole militant thing and told me how bad it was. And I was there, and I was like, well, actually, a council that wanted to protect jobs, to build houses, take people out of the slums, was in confrontation with Margaret Thatcher's government, because obviously they didn't want to protect jobs. They didn't want to build houses for poor people. What they wanted to do was to create profits for their own class. And that was a time of very much confrontation. And one of the interesting things about that is how Thatcher politicised Heysel. It would take too long to explain all the components that created Heysel, but you cannot deny the culpability of Liverpool fans. They were a link in the causal chain. You take any of the links out, and Heysel doesn't happen, but Liverpool were a big link. So let's get that straight. There's no denial of that here.
And Heysel, for those people who don't remember it or who don't know, it was the tragedy in the stadium in Brussels in which 39 mostly Italian supporters died attending the European Cup final between Liverpool and Juventus of Italy.
Yes, yes. And immediately it happened, Thatcher politicised it. And she said, I'm not surprised, the violence of these people. Look at the records in industrial relations. She conflated striking with violence. I wrote a book about that dreadful year, 85 and 86. And Peter Reid, who was Everton's captain at the time, said to me, what Thatcher did is she used Heysel as part of her assault on working class culture. So she had the two things that she hated and pigeonholed as part of the enemy within, which was the city of Liverpool and football fans. Well, let's go a bit further back. The term Scouser, which came into existence about 100 years ago, is an insult. It is used to light fun of people who use soup kitchens or who ate the poorest gruel on the streets of Liverpool, the cheapest stew. And Scouser was an insult aimed at the Liverpool Irish community, which was co-opted and reclaimed by sort of my parents. Now, it didn't appear in the Oxford English Dictionary until 1947, and it's an insult. If you notice, many of the songs that are sung about Liverpool are about poverty. You know, feed the Scousers at Christmas. The Mancunians call us bin dippers, which comes from you look in the dustbin for something to eat, you find a dead rat and you think it's a treat. Many of the songs which are sung at us all over the country are about hunger, because deep in the folk memory of particularly the English is the famine and the way Liverpool changed. And Liverpool is associated with many of the cliches about Liverpool, drunkenness, sentimentality, violence, are also applied to the Irish. And there's this deep-seated anti-Irishness which reflects itself in the way Liverpool as a city is treated.
And very often Liverpool supporters will refuse to sing the national anthem, which I guess would be seen as Scousers, if you'll forgive me that term, paying back to the rest of British society, but I guess particularly English society, for what they perceive to be historical injustice.
Yeah, I never grew up with a sense of being English. Quite the opposite. I was Scouse. I was different to them. I wasn't like them. And I booed the national anthem. I admit it. I've booed the national anthem going back to the 70s. And people take it as an insult. Well, you know what? They chant about poverty. We boo privilege. I don't understand it. You know, it's like they're endorsing the cornerstone of the class system in this national anthem. If it was an inclusive national anthem that talked about offering opportunity to us all, I'd probably sing it, but not God Save the King. You know, your imaginary gods and your imaginary royalty, you know, they're only imaginary in the sense that they're supposed to be better than us, and they're born supposed to be better than us. You know, you endorse that? What's wrong with you?
I mentioned Kelvin Mackenzie, the author of the Sun headline, The Truth, which, as I say, was a lie. People like Rod Liddell, people like Boris Johnson as well, who insulted the city of Liverpool. There does seem to be this particular thread of right-wing populists who don't like Liverpool, don't like what it stands for, and as I guess as the most prominent feature nationally of Liverpool FC become the focus for that.
Yeah, I mean, the self-pity city narrative, like I say, deep in the folk memory of the British people, the English in particular, is the sense that Liverpool are outsiders. We're immigrants. We come in. We shouldn't be there. I mean, the Orange Lodge marched in the city. They still march, but the sectarianism was still big as late as the 70s. We had Protestant Party MPs. But even those people, even the Protestant Party, they're outside the pale of British politics. They're not recognisable to Middle England. But they trot out the same lines, self-pity city. Do you know what? There's no place in the world that has less self-pity. In fact, it should be arrogant city, because we're not taking it. We're better than that. You know, I suspect, one, if Hillsborough would have happened to any other team from any other city in the country, there wouldn't have been the cover-up, there wouldn't have been the behaviour like that. It would have been better. But certainly, if there had been, people wouldn't still be fighting for justice now all that time on. We're not taking it. You know why? Because we deserve better. Because we're not the chosen people, but we are people who deserve respect. And we don't think the authority should ride roughshod over us because we have more self-worth than that.
Where do we go with this, Tony? You think of the awful horrors that football supporters, whatever their background, experienced at Hillsborough, at Heysel. You think of the tragedy, I mentioned it earlier, of Munich as well, in which Manchester United players and officials died. How do we move beyond this in football and in British society, mocking each other for our misfortune?
Adrian, I really don't know. I think the only way is if we shift the sort of basis of British society. We're living in a world where if people on small boats in the Channel drown, kids die, the joy on social media from all these right-wing nutcases is boundless. And the thing is, there was less of this sort of tragedy chanting, say back in the mid-2000s. You'd have the usual suspects. United do it a bit, but not as much as now. Chelsea always did it, but again, not as much as now. We saw last year or the year before Shrewsbury Town fans doing it. And I think there's a meanness at play in Britain now, which comes from austerity, which comes from 14 years of Tory government, which has made a lot of people spiteful and has caused a lot of finger pointing. I think if the country gets back to a wealthier, more equitable situation, I think it will die down a bit. In the meantime, I don't really know what we can do. I don't think closing stadiums or banning fans would work. I think that will merely amplify it. I suppose the other thing is to try and educate people about it. But you know what? We're banging our heads against the brick wall. I did a talk to some students with another Hillsborough campaigner, and they asked him what it was like to talk about it. And he said something that really had resonance for me. He said, every time we speak about this, it feels like a little bit of yourself flakes off, a little bit more of yourself. And I've been losing it for 35 years. But we can't give up because you know what? We're not doing it for us. We're doing it for everyone else. Even those people who are singing always the victims' errors. Because anytime their loved ones go to a public event, we want them to be aware that they'll be protected to the best of the authorities' ability. And if it goes wrong, they won't be blamed and demonised.
Tony, thank you for your time and for your insight. It's been really fascinating to hear from you. I'm Adrian Goldberg. This has been the Byline Times podcast. If you want to support our work, by the way, then do please think about taking out a subscription to the Byline Times. That's our brilliant monthly newspaper, which not only has the best of our online articles, but features that you can't read anywhere else. So head over to bylinetimes.com and think about taking out a subscription. We'll be very grateful if you do. This has been a We Bring audio production by me and Harvey White in Birmingham. We'll see you again very soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.